Hi everyone. Welcome to this discussion hosted by the Hunter College High School Alumni Association on the 2020 election and security, threats of political violence, cyber attacks, and more. I'm Rachel Goldbrenner. I'll be moderating today's discussion, and I want to thank the Alumni Association for convening us for this very timely event and for all of you for joining us. We're now 26 days away from the election, and of course, in many places, voting is already well underway. There's obviously a great deal of concern and anxiety about the upcoming election, perhaps more so than at any other time in any of our memories. And of course, today we're especially anxious following the very disturbing news out of Michigan. So I'm grateful personally to be here today with two esteemed Hunter grads who have a wealth of experience and perspectives that can help us understand how to make sense of the challenges that we're facing as a country in the next several weeks and beyond. So let me briefly introduce them and myself, and then we'll get the show on the road. I am currently the executive director of the Reese Center on Law and Security at NYU School of Law, and I have a background as both a lawyer and a foreign policy official. I served in the Obama administration at the National Security Council, the United States Mission to the United Nations, and the State Department. I'd say in this room, perhaps the most important thing to know about me is that during my time at Hunter, I was a student in Mr. Kagan's social studies class, not once, not twice, but 3 times, which is probably a big reason that I ended up feeling inspired to follow his career path and also why I felt prepared for it. So a big thank you to Mr. Kagan, whose face I think I saw flash across the screen. And to all the other educators at Hunter who made such a big impact on all of our lives. So our first panelist, Ambassador Karen Cornblue, is Senior Fellow and Director of the German Marshall Fund's Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative, which works to ensure that technology supports democracies around the globe. And she is Chair of the Open Technology Fund, a government-funded nonprofit advancing global internet freedom. She served as a U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development during the Obama administration, where she spearheaded the first global internet policymaking principles and launched the OECD Gender Initiative. She also served in the Clinton administration as both Deputy Chief of Staff at the Treasury Department and Director of the Office of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs at the FCC, negotiating early internet policies. She was Policy Director for then Senator Barack Obama and the author of his 2008 platform. Our second panelist, Josh Geltz, is the founding executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown Law, where he's also a visiting professor. He is an executive editor at the online forum Just Security and an international security program fellow at New America. From 2015 to 17, Josh was the senior director for counterterrorism at the National Security Council. Prior to that, he was deputy legal advisor to the NSC and counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice. He also served as a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer. Okay, so in the next hour, we're going to try to touch on a pretty broad range of issues and a very big subject of elections and security. And we'll leave some time at the end for questions from all of you in the audience. In the meantime, before that, if you could please keep your mics muted, that'll help the conversation be audible. And I just wanted to say that for those of you who are left wanting at the end of this discussion to delve in further to a lot of the things that we're talking about, I would just commend to you very highly the prolific writings and the commentary of our esteemed panelists here. So with that, I think let's get things started. And Josh, let me start with one of the first questions that's come up a lot in recent days, I think. What happens if the president becomes incapacitated or dies between the before the election, or if the president-elect is similarly afflicted between the election and Inauguration Day?
Well, first, let me just thank the Hunter Alumni Association for making this possible. I'm grateful for that. I'm even more grateful for everything Hunter has given me in life. It's wonderful to see former teachers, Ms. Meeker, Mr. Kagan on here, former principal, Dr. Miserandino, all sorts of friendly faces, at least friendly names right now. And the time that I had with the Hunter community, I cherish and I continue to benefit from. It's really created everything thereafter. It's made it all possible. So I'm grateful for that, and grateful for the chance to be with Rachel and Karen and all of you tonight for this discussion. So the most important answer to Rachel's set of questions really is there is a plan for that. In other words, it is remarkable to be talking about what it might mean for a presidential candidate or even someone who is the presumptive incoming president after the Electoral College has met, for example, to pass away or become incapacitated. But there are plans for that. And I won't go through every permutation, but they're kind of what you think they might be. At the stage before the Electoral College has met, this year that happens on December 14, essentially the electors belong in a sense to their parties, and the parties can choose someone else for whom to cast their votes. After they meet, it's more like the chain of succession, such that the vice president presumptive, after the Electoral College meets, would presumably step in and take that role. There was actually a national commission that tried to spell all this out a few years ago, and the plans exist if they're complicated. In some ways, what I think is even harder and more novel is a related question, which is, what do we have right now, or what do we have short of full incapacitation or death? In other words, we have a president right now, whether one likes his policies or dislikes his policies, who has been diagnosed as having a virus that's quite serious, and who is on medication to treat that virus that is itself quite serious and can have quite serious side effects. That is a threshold short of triggering those various complicated but nonetheless existing plans that raises all sorts of questions about what it means for the country, or at least the executive branch, to be in those hands. And this conversation is timely in many ways, but among them is the fact that just a few hours before we gathered, the Speaker of the House, along with another congressman, a former constitutional law professor, a congressman from Maryland, Jamie Raskin, announced that tomorrow they'll be introducing a bill to create a task force that would essentially evaluate these questions and the broader question of when the 25th Amendment gets triggered, such that a president should be relieved of powers and duties because they are unable. They're not fully incapacitated, perhaps. They may not be deceased, of course, but whether they're operating at a level where we can entrust the country to them. That is the strange state in which we find ourselves, and yet they are the right questions to be asking given the medical condition of our current commander-in-chief. Back to you, Rachel.
Thanks. Just a quick follow-up. Is the intent of that task force to be clarifying things for future generations, or is this meant to opine in time for the questions that we're facing right now?
No, unfortunately, this is, in Washington, there's a phrase, never let a good emergency go to waste. So the idea is in that we are confronted with these problems, challenges, at least set a path that would make addressing them the next time they arise more imaginable, more feasible. Of course, it doesn't take any of this right now to trigger handing over powers, at least temporarily, to the vice president under the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment has two provisions, actually has a few provisions, but two of relevance here. One in which essentially others say to the president, you're no longer up to the job. The president can attempt to challenge that, and Congress can ultimately make a determination. But there's also voluntary handing over duties and responsibilities, which presidents as recent as George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan have done when they were about to undergo surgery. And I have gone on record in the Washington Post as saying I think it's irresponsible for the current president not to do that for as long as independent medical advice suggests is appropriate. So one doesn't even need elaborate legal architecture to voluntarily put this country essentially in trust until at least the current condition, the current medical condition of the president is deemed to have ended.
Thanks. It's helpful to have that landscape laid out, and I think it's important to note, as you started with, that there is in fact a plan for this. So switching gears slightly, but in a similar vein of things that people are really thinking about a lot in this election, I wanted to talk a little bit about information. So one of the foundations of democracy, and by extension of elections, is the free flow of information. Candidates need to be able to explain what they stand for and to draw contrasts with their opponents. Election officials need to be able to communicate about the mechanics and logistics of how citizens can cast their ballots. And society needs to have a baseline sense of acceptance and legitimacy around the administration of the elections and their outcome. Yet, as we all well know, we're in an age where the information space is more diffuse, it's more fast moving, and it's more contested than ever before, and it's increasingly manipulated and weaponized. So there's a lot, obviously, to talk about here, but Karen, given your long expertise and work in this area, I thought maybe you could start us off with just some fundamental understandings of the landscape here. And in particular, if you could talk a little bit about what is likely to be the role and influence of those big social media companies that we keep hearing all about, Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, in the upcoming elections, and what are the true big dilemmas that we're facing in ensuring that their platforms are used responsibly and don't contribute to misinformation and disinformation around the election and its results. These are obviously thorny questions that you've grappled with a lot, but it doesn't mean that there aren't answers.
Great. Thanks so much for that question. I'm really delighted to be on this panel, and I'm learning a lot already from Josh, as I always do, and Rachel. And thanks for the organizers of this so much. And thanks, of course, to Hunter. I'm going to mention Ira Marienhoff, even though he's not with us any longer, but he scared us and / inspired us. Those of us who studied with him when he would call us talented, gifted, and uninformed, to try to become a little more informed. So on the social media front, where I'm struggling along with everybody else to make sense of it and find metaphors that aren't embarrassingly inadequate, one of the ways I was talking about it with a reporter today is we tend to think of, individual pieces of content and misinformation, and the platforms have all too often thought about it that way as well. Is this piece of content false or true? Should we take action against this piece of content, as if it's individual snowflakes? When in fact, in the foreign interference context, we can see that that's not an adequate way of looking at it, that they're bad actors who mount disinformation campaigns. They're quite strategic. And we've seen now that the line between domestic and foreign is really bleeding into itself. And so these same kinds of, as opposed to snowflakes, let's think of it as a snow machine, and they blow artificial snow through the information system, creating avalanches, if you will, block this metaphor, and really changing our democratic debate. So this idea of looking piece of content by piece of content, which you would not think is adequate. If there's Russian misinformation, you shouldn't think of it as adequate in what's going on in the domestic space. And part of what's happened is a whole infrastructure, supply chain, if you will, of disinformation has taken its place on top of the social media platforms. So you have these outlets, fake news sites. They pretend to be journalism, but they're really just branded content mills. And they churn out stuff that's supposed to look like news, but uses none of the sourcing, none of the transparency. There's no masthead. The headline bears no resemblance to the content, and they're churning out, accusations and arguments. And then there's coordinated promotion of that through a bunch of pages on Facebook, influencers on YouTube. Then there are these coordinated networks on Twitter that push it out. There are these groups that you're hearing about a lot in the news today, private groups. Very concerning are these Boogaloo groups that have been taken down recently, QAnon groups that have been taken down, but there are a bunch of other groups that are still online, Second Amendment groups, Reopen groups that were set up in the shutdown, which are very, share a lot of conspiracy theories about vaccinations and again, they're going to take your guns away, and 5G is giving you COVID. And then what happens is anything can be fed into this infrastructure. So whether it's Russian misinformation coming from RT or coming from a hack and leak, whether it's some, citizen who's thinks he's part of Donald Trump's army of protecting the ballot, and he sees something that he thinks is a fraud, or again, it's one of these coordinated networks that's been set up by a PR firm even, and they can trigger just this tsunami, this avalanche of disinformation that can travel very quickly. And the platforms, unfortunately, have not shown that they are able to react in real time quickly enough. So we've seen a few instances where some of these COVID conspiracy theory videos have gone viral and have gotten, 20 million views in 12 hours before the platforms finally said, oh, wait a minute, that violates our terms of service against COVID misinformation. And there isn't this sense that, no, we better pause, we better have a circuit breaker when something starts going that viral and jumping into the groups and being algorithmically amplified, to take a look, not take it down, but before we let it continue to be amplified, let's take a look at it and see if it's harmful, see if it poses a risk. They're grappling with it. My fear is that just as they didn't quite see the systemic nature of the problem before 2016 from the Russians, that they may not be quite getting their arms around the systemic nature of what we have now and being a little bit too reactive. So as you see Facebook just put in place a policy saying they're not going to have election ads after the election. Why are we seeing these changes at the very last minute? Why isn't there this systemic look and a sense that, we're going to be a little risk averse in this moment on election related stuff, not taking it down, not taking down people's speech, but taking down dampening the amplification, putting labels on things, creating a little friction so things can't quite so smoothly spread. We need to see a lot more seriousness around it. And it was interesting. People are wondering if the Facebook very serious takedown of QAnon recently had anything to do with they're getting a sense of the issue with Governor Whitmer, and that they started to realize, gee, this is really serious. But we should have had that sooner because there's been violence already. So anyway, that's an overview.
Very helpful, thank you. You spoke mostly about the grappling that the companies themselves are doing and the decisions that they're taking. Can you tell us a little bit about, what ultimately of this is a matter for the companies to be deciding themselves and for the private sector to be leading on it, and what ultimately is something that the government either can or should be stepping in or has? How do you sort of think about that?
So there's a lot the government, so a lot of what I talk about is what the government needs to do. And so just, you went through very nicely my background. I started out as a regulator of mass media and telecom, and then I worked on the early internet regs or internet framework. And it's very, very lightly, it's a very light touch, we call it, policy framework, because when that framework was created, it was an infant industry. It was competitive to the existing industries, both broadcast and telecom. And unfortunately, we didn't keep up our thinking. We didn't keep refreshing it as the industry got more and more centralized, few companies, this algorithmic promotion, so your news feed is filtered through them. And there's a lot that we can do that's really commonsensical. Updating our consumer protection rules and privacy, updating our civil rights rules, campaign finance rules. There's this bipartisan Honest Ads Act that would bring some of the existing transparency regulation around ads. So there's just a whole bunch of updating of existing frameworks, policy frameworks that we can do that pose very little First Amendment risk, and that can be accommodated, to take action on deep fakes and so-called dark patterns, which trick you into there's ways that the platform uses user design to trick you into doing things. These kinds of things should be seen as consumer protection issues. So there's a bunch of that. We have to do a lot to support journalism, which has really been decimated as their ad revenue has moved to the platforms. So there has to be some way of figuring out how to fund journalism, and there are a bunch of different things being talked about and tried in different countries. And then we just have, some of this stuff does pose a big First Amendment issue, and you do need to have the platforms do it, but they should be doing it in a much more accountable way with a lot more transparency, and their feet being held a little bit more to the fire. So there's a lot of policy. And then of course there's the competition issue. A big 400-page report just came out this week about some of the things that could be done on the competition side. So there's a big policy agenda. It's been really confused because I think people want to fix everything at once. And so there's this one internet law that everybody keeps grabbing onto. Josh just wrote an article about it. And we don't think of any other sector in the economy where we're going to do one thing and fix it all. There are a bunch of little common sense things that we need to do, but I don't think any of that is going to be put in place before the election. But I think it's helpful to talk about, because the more the platforms feel that we all understand, the more responsible I think they'll be.
Right. Great. Thank you so much for distilling so much into a really cogent laying out. So I wanted to turn to another question that's pulled from the headlines and pertains to election-related violence. So the news today that we already have mentioned, that a group of people have been charged in a plot to abduct the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, is obviously a very disturbing development. And it makes plain a longstanding fear that we will see a rise in political violence around the election, in particular by armed militia groups that could engage in voter intimidation, for example, near polling places. So Josh, I know that your center has done a lot of work on this issue, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your views on how serious and widespread is this problem and what can be done to prevent these groups from affecting the elections.
Yeah, thanks for the chance to talk about it, Rachel. And today, obviously a disturbing day as far as the plot goes, and yet in some ways, yet another day that reminds us that law enforcement, below the level of politics, works very hard to keep Americans safe. In this case, local law enforcement as well as the FBI, which was brought in on the matter. But let's start from a fundamental recognition that these sorts of private militias, unsanctioned militias, they violate the law in all 50 states. People don't always start from that premise. Sometimes people assume that the First Amendment protects what they do, because the First Amendment does protect a lot of hateful expression and even association with others who want to engage in hateful expression. The Second Amendment protects a certain right to bear arms, individual right to bear arms in self-defense. And of course, some states have open carry laws. And if you put all that together, you still do not get a right to do what these private militias do. Quite the opposite. Instead, the laws differ a bit state to state, but every state has at least one of the following laws: a constitutional provision saying that military units must be under the control of the civilian authorities. 48 states have that in their state constitutions. It means you can't be a rogue army unit. You have to be an actual militia, a sanctioned militia that reports up to the civil authority. It's usually the governor. States also have laws criminalizing those who purport to be law enforcement and those who purport to do law enforcement things, which is often what these militias show up and purport to do. They act as if they're entitled to put themselves between some protesters and some counter protesters, or some protesters and the statue that they're protesting. But it's over a century ago, the US Supreme Court, in a case called Presser versus Illinois, upheld the constitutionality of an Illinois law that criminalized basically this sort of activity. And even in the recent line of cases about the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms in self-defense, that decision was reaffirmed. This is one of the things that the Second Amendment does not protect, and its state laws criminalize and prevent. And so once you start looking at the issue that way, today becomes just, in a sense, the tip of the iceberg, a manifestation, a very worrisome manifestation of what these groups might do in their worst moments. But fundamentally, the existence of unaccountable, unsanctioned private paramilitaries, rogue army units, is a threat to basic democratic order, to the notion that the legitimate use of force belongs to the state and the state alone. And so I think there is reason to worry about what these groups, taking their cues from a president who had a chance to denounce them in the first presidential debate and chose the opposite, what these groups might do to intimidate voters, to make the country worry about violence to the extent they think that helps their candidate of choice, and even to intimidate those who play a role in the election process, especially if that process is drawn out during protracted counting of mail-in ballots, for example. And so you were nice enough, Rachel, to mention the work that my colleagues at Georgetown Law and I do at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection on this set of issues. We litigate some of these matters, and I can talk more about that if it's of interest, but just to show how concerned the public is about this issue set. We went live a few weeks ago with state-by-state fact sheets, 2 pages on every state, the basic law about this, including the provisions of that state's laws, and what to do if you see things that you think are private paramilitaries near a polling station, even a voter registration drive. We have now had almost 500,000 visits to that webpage on our website, which is a lot more than we normally get for anything.
Okay. So Josh, you were telling us about some of ICAP's work on militias and the intense interest that you've been seeing just in the few days since you posted.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, it really does. Our interruption is fitting, right? The idea of people taking various things into their own hands, whether it's physical force in the physical world or virtual intrusion in the virtual world. It's the same basic problem, right? Of trying to privatize the ability to intimidate and coerce others. So we have had just an unbelievable response to these fact sheets, which maybe I'll drop them into the chat when I'm done talking, in case folks are interested in taking a look. And what I hope that shows is that people are thinking about this ahead of time. Not that they're scared, not that they won't vote in whatever way suits them, whether that's by mail if they're in a state that permits it, whether that's early voting in a state that permits it, but instead that they do want to know how to deal with a situation that would have frankly been pretty unthinkable, not for all of American history to be sure, but in recent American history, and which has become all too thinkable right now, and certainly today as we have this conversation in the wake of those charges against the group of 6 that apparently was plotting to kidnap the governor of Michigan.
Right. It's very sobering. Thank you. So I see Karen is back, and I think we'll just keep going and see how far we get, and maybe we can stick around a couple of extra minutes for those of you who bravely came back. So I wanted to ask, in an op-ed several years ago, Sherilyn Ifill, who's the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, argued powerfully that racism is a national security threat. She focused especially on voting rights, writing that, quote, "It is clear we can no longer think of foreign election meddling as a phenomenon separate from attempts to disenfranchise Americans of color. Racial injustice remains a real vulnerability in our democracy, one that foreign powers are only too willing to attack. If anything, these vulnerabilities are even more prominent and urgent and painful today. Just this week, the Department of Homeland Security released a report citing white supremacists as posing one of the most persistent and lethal threats to the country. So I just wanted to ask really to both of you, but maybe we can start with you, Karen, how you see these issues playing out in this election cycle. And obviously a lot of it has to do with the social media space and with the sort of blurring that you talked at the beginning about between the kind of domestic and the foreign.
Yeah, it's such a great and huge topic, but I think it's really important to realize the information that we got thanks to the Senate Intelligence Committee about what the Russians did in the run-up to the 2016 election shows the incredible targeting, not only of racial divisions, not only of, all different kinds of vulnerable communities. So there was a lot of anti-Muslim activity, but specifically African Americans and specifically voter suppression. So there was both fake Black Lives Matter sites that became more popular than the original Black Lives Matter site. They were taking over and organizing rallies and events, protests, and they were targeting African Americans most perniciously with advertising meant to do voter suppression. And this is what you can do in micro-targeting is if you get information on the other guy, and you can persuade or you can try to suppress the vote. And it's very frightening. And there's not, there's always been the mailers and the the stuff that's been done, the dark arts of politics, but it couldn't be done at scale with so much information, so predictably targeted at your opponent's base. And it's very frightening. And I think we really have to, you asked about policies before, I think we need to really update voting rights, obviously voting rights laws, but also to incorporate some of these issues. And we need to look at the advertising rules, and we need to update our civil rights laws. Some people have talked about updating the idea of a public accommodation, even to think of some of these spaces the way you would think of a lunch counter or something like that, where you can't side with people who are forcing people out. If you're a Black woman trying to be a journalist, you have to be on Twitter. If you're harassed and harangued and targeted and given rape threats, it's going to be pretty hard for you to do your job. So I think we have to think about some of these civil rights issues in a new way, the privacy rules as well. But I'm sort of rambling away from your question. They are definitely national security issues. They are definitely election issues. And, we're seeing that appeal to identity, but identity in the most base, manner as we head into the election. And I think there has to be some hard looking about how social media enables that.
And Rachel, if you let me, can I just jump in to connect what, in some ways, Karen's saying to, I see a couple folks in the chat talking about how disturbing it was, right? To have people shouting all sorts of epithets when you're sitting here having a conversation, watching a conversation. I suspect Karen and Rachel and I have read enough accounts of this that we're sort of unfortunately knew what it was as it happened, and are glad to have folks return for this conversation. But to those for whom it was new, it is disturbing, and it really connects to exactly what Karen's talking about now, which is the reach of the internet, right? The fact that in an election interference context, the thing that the internet enables, for all the wonderful things it enables, is foreign powers to reach in and intrusively and spread disinformation, malinformation, which is a term sometimes Karen will correct me if I get this wrong, but information that is selectively and in its content and timing released. It may not be false the way disinformation is, but it's used for bad purpose, hence the term malinformation. And it's intrusive in a sense, on the level of our democracy, in the same way that we all just experienced in the level of individuals in this conversation. When the U.S. entered World War I after many, many years of neutrality, one of the first things it did was it cut one of the main underwater cables that connected it to Europe, because it could insulate itself from what it thought would be German, especially German propaganda, by just cutting a single underwater cable. And it basically kept foreign actors from intruding into domestic politics and from distorting our own democracy. There's no one cable to cut in 2016 or 2020. And so it's that sense of what cyber-enabled intrusion is that's in some ways at the heart of the challenges that Karen has worked so hard to draw attention to and to help to devise solutions for over the past years, but that remain, I think Karen and I would both agree, very much unfinished business in terms of how real they are as the 2020 cycle is on.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that full circle. And
can I just say one thing, Rachel? So that's called Zoom bombing, and it is really common. I don't study this, and I should have studied it more. I thought that Zoom had done something to make that less common. I just Googled while Josh was talking, and it just happened at Penn in a bunch of classes last week.
Yeah.
So it's a major challenge, and I'm so sorry to everybody who had to live with this. It was, apparently it gets much worse. You wind up seeing nudity, and can be really quite terrible. So I'm really sorry that happened to everybody.
Yeah, can I just interfere? I apologize. It's that we had a waiting room, and I took it away so you guys could come in faster. And with the waiting room, there's possible to screen it at. So we have the waiting room installed again. So hopefully it won't happen again. And I didn't come up because I was throwing those people out. I was locating them and throwing them out. So, but we have the waiting room back, so I won't let them in. And sorry for the interruption, everyone. Back at you guys.
Thanks very much. And thanks to all of you who came back to finish out the conversation, which I think is important to do in the face of those kinds of attacks, because it shouldn't be the end of our conversation. We should be able to reconstitute in a way that's more secure, which I think we've done. So, and Josh, I think you sort of merged nicely into the next question, which is, I think a bunch of audience members actually asked in some pre-submitted questions, which is basically understanding what is happening with respect to the election specifically. So we were just talking about a sort of broader, online communication, but with respect to the elections, what's happening by and from our foreign adversaries. And I just wanted to contextualize this with a quote that was recently given by President Trump's former National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, who is not exactly somebody who's been really outspoken on these things since he left. He's been largely quiet. And came out with some pretty scathing comments that I think are worth injecting into the conversation. So in talking about the president's reticence to address election interference threats posed by Russia specifically, McMaster said, "He is aiding and abetting Putin's efforts by not being direct about this. This sustained campaign of disruption, disinformation, and denial is aided by any leader who doesn't acknowledge it." So can you talk a little bit about what we should be expecting from Russia? We know a lot about 2016, but can you tell us about 2020 in the way of cyber attacks or intrusions? And then maybe very briefly at the end, obviously there's also, in an effort to kind of downplay the role of Russia, there's a lot of focus that comes out of Washington sometimes about China and Iran, and whether that is also something that we need to be looking out for, or if the game in town this time around is really Russia.
In some ways, here's how I think about the main difference in the disinformation campaign we see in 2020 from what we saw in 2016, and the role of Russia in both, which was in 2016, Russia created a lot of disinformation around our elections, and Americans amplified it. They often amplified it unwittingly, in other words, not knowing it to be Russian in origin, some perhaps wittingly, or at least suspecting it and not minding. But in 2020, Americans are creating a lot of disinformation, and the Russians are amplifying it. And those Americans include political officials, not to mention widely followed media sources. So when we even saw, for those who watched the vice presidential candidate debate last night, we saw something originally concocted as a Russian piece of propaganda, the notion that that it was not, in fact, Russia behind the election interference of 2016, and that Secretary Clinton and her campaign had cast aspersions on Russia as part of a campaign strategy. When we heard that parroted back by the current vice president, that's disinformation now starting here and being amplified back, because entities like Russia Today, RT, increasingly quote Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Bill Barr directly because they just need to amplify it back. So that's not to say Russia isn't doing things of its own, proactive things, but I think in some ways they're able to sit back more and amplify what Americans, as we are so divided and polarized, but more than divided and polarized, there's a streak that's actually concocts and disseminates disinformation. There's an ability to just amplify that in a way that makes it easier. And while the tech companies have tried, I think short of where Karen or I would like to see them, have tried to be more ready in 2020 than they were in 2016, our government is, if anything, less ready, at least at the political level, because you have political leadership in the White House that has denied the problem even existing in the first place and has resisted when other entities like Congress have urged or even passed laws designed to try to punish entities like Russia, countries like Russia, for what happened in 2016. Below that political level, I do think you have a malign influence task force at FBI and other parts of our government who have tried to work to address the problem. And you see increasingly that when some of the tech companies make public takedowns of election-related disinformation networks, they say that it's based on a tip given to them by the government. And the fact that that's happening is a good thing. The fact that the tech companies are willing to say it strikes me as a good thing, because their own ideologies once would have led them to feel very reluctant about even acknowledging that help, even though many of us think they need that help and more. I'll say quickly, I realize this has been a long answer to the question, Rachel, but you asked about some of the other countries. I think other countries learned from what Russia did in 2016 and from the Trump administration's non-response or minimal response to it, that this is an area at least worth thinking about. This influence operations, especially influence operations via social media and the internet, especially ones designed to get at the American people, not just at particular officials, the way more traditional counterintelligence threats can sometimes arise. How they're deploying it, how they plan to use it going forward, it's not as clear, although we've seen senior officials talk about China increasingly occupying this space. But the very fact that you'd have other countries with the takeaway that one can use this as a vector of malign influence towards the United States and not pay a price, I think that's a dangerous place to be. And it means that the next 4 weeks or sometime thereafter, while this election is still being sorted out, could be a really, really wild one online, to the extent some of these actors want to use that forum, that setting, to spread disinformation.
So we are butting up against time, but obviously had a little hiatus in the middle. So I think Karen and Josh and I are all able to stick around for another 10 or 15 minutes or so. And I do want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience. And I see some of them popping up in the chat, so please feel free to take the mic and articulate them when we get there. So I will cut down the long list of questions that we had thought we might talk about, and I just wanted to flag that one thing that perhaps can come up in the Q&A that we didn't get to here is some of the issues around absentee voting, whether there really are issues, what to be concerned about there, and a whole host of other things to be concerned about. So I just wanted to end with one last question from me before we go to the audience that has to do with this parade of horribles that we have spent time talking about, and the real fears and anxieties that so many of us who are concerned citizens have about what's happening and what will happen after November 3rd. And those are obviously real, but I thought it would also be useful to end, if not exactly on a hopeful note, then at least on a sort of a note of perspective and level setting. And I wanted to ask you both in particular, as people who who are experts with public platforms, who have served in positions where you've been entrusted with looking out for the country's security, how you think about the balance of calibrating appropriately between vigilance on the one hand, which is kind of where we've been in the last hour, like being, issue spotting, being aware of what's coming down the horizon, preparing for it, knowing what the legal landscape is, knowing what the private sector can do. So vigilance on the one hand, and potentially overblowing the fears on the other hand, to the point where voters lose faith in the process or in the outcome, or both, in an election that can feel so high stakes and so existential to so many. There's really a risk in catastrophizing everything. So, but it's very hard balance to strike. So I don't think there's a right answer, but I'd love to know what you each think.
Yeah, I can try to start with that. I think it's a great question, and you can see there's a very active conversation that's been going on in the journalism community for a long time about how to cover these things, and some really interesting historical work that's been done looking at how Nazis were covered in America. And there is this myth that we all have that, oh, they were given coverage and sunlight is the best disinfectant. But in fact, there was apparently quite a concerted campaign by a number of Jewish leaders to go around community to community when a Nazi rally was coming, to talk to the newspapers about how to cover it, and to either not cover it, to not give it oxygen, or to contextualize it. And I think that's very interesting as we think about how to cover the white supremacist activity in the same kind of sensitivity that we might cover suicides. That we need to be very careful, not provide enough, hints that somebody will want to follow up and go do a Google search and get all this more disinformation and join. But on the other hand, I think it's really a mistake, especially in this era, to hide the ball. I think it's really important to empower people with as much information as possible and to trust them. You know, I keep thinking about the whole issue where we told people not to use masks at the beginning of the epidemic. And I understand there's scientific disagreement about it, but apparently some public health officials didn't want to tell people to wear masks because then they might take them from health workers. And now there's all this cynicism and conspiracy theories about masks, obviously caused by many things, but in part by that. So I think we have to arm people with information, give them information, but it has to be contextualized and it has to be done with a lot of thought. And my tiny bit of hope, since you asked for some, is I do feel like I feel like the media is getting more skeptical, and I feel like the average people are getting skeptical. And there were a number of October surprises of the ilk that Josh was just talking about, you know, sort of Russian, sort of DOJ, you know, it planned for this election season. And they've kind of sputtered, not only because there wasn't enough information, you know, to even create the facsimile, but I think that you know, when they were dropped, there was just enough sophistication about them, so they didn't go further. So I do feel like giving people, I think, you know, the media education is going to happen in real time, and so we have to be really talking about this and thinking about it.
And to add, hopefully some hope-inspiring points before we open it up to questions, you know, in some ways, I think the challenges we face are cognitive. They are things that people can fend off so long as they realize what's truth and what's falsity, or what the law says and what the law doesn't say. And that's, in a sense, empowering, or at least I think it should be. So, Rachel, just to hit on the issue you raised of mail-in ballots. Mail-in ballots, the statistics show, are perfectly trustworthy. The level of fraud through them is minuscule, statistically insignificant. What is happening right now is there's a concerted effort by some to make people doubt that. So the response doesn't actually need to handle mail-in ballots. It has to deal with cognitive challenge of people spreading lies. I guess to Karen's point, I don't want to sort of dress it up or use a euphemism, spreading lies about it. Similarly, the idea that the election is somehow illegitimate if we don't know its results on election day or election night, right. It's just not so. That's not federal law. That's not state law. It's not actually custom. At least in presidential elections, a lot of us stay up late because we do want to know, but often, in especially other races, one doesn't know until all the ballots have been counted. So as a legal challenge or as a legal argument, it's really not much. It's pretty lousy. What it is instead a cognitive challenge, trying to get people to anticipate that if networks are telling them, or if others, election officials are telling them that there isn't a result yet, that there will somehow be a legitimacy question. And again, that's in a sense empowering, because once we spread the word that that's not true, that's not the law, that's not practice, that's not even common sense, ultimately, instead common sense is count all the ballots that should be counted, it's empowering because it lets us all basically fight disinformation and recalibrate expectations. And so I think that's, in a sense, it lets all of us play a role in trying to keep this election cycle more secure and yield a more legitimate result, ultimately.
Thank you. That was, in fact, hopeful, which is impressive, but I think true, and comes down to, I think, a question that was picked up in some of the questions that folks were pre-submitting, which basically had to do with what's the role of the citizen and what can we each individually do. We've been talking a lot about the government and big, huge companies and those in power, and I think what you were just addressing has a lot to do with our own ourselves and our communities. Okay, so I am going to turn it over to Aniko to administer the questions from the audience, and I would just ask, as usual, to please keep it brief and in the form of a question, and the panelists would be happy to answer.
So we can have everyone, you could take your videos back and you can unmute yourself. If I can ask you to raise your hand so I can call on you so we know who is asking the question, that would be great. But while we're waiting for a question, we have one from Robert in the chat, who is asking if we can hear about your thoughts on this Washington Post news related to Facebook today. You guys could address it while we're waiting for more questions. That would be great.
I'm not sure which news. I
don't know what Robert is referring to. I think he's referring to something in the conversation. I can't see Robert, so.
Oh, maybe it's about Charlie Kirk. So this is part of what I was talking about, that there are this infrastructure, these networks set up online. They just live there, and then they pump out the disinformation and they amplify it and they get it into everybody's news feeds. So there's this young conservative called Charlie Kirk, I think his name is. He runs this thing called Turning Point USA. It's all these real right-wing but very clean-cut folks, and they had gotten apparently teenagers. Josh, correct me if I've got this wrong. They'd gotten a bunch of teenagers who had set up fake pages on Facebook and fake accounts on Twitter, and they were commenting favorably as far as Trump and unfavorably as far as Democrats all across the internet. Unfortunately, it's another instance where I think journalists found it, academics found it, embarrassed the platforms, and they did do a major takedown today, which is, I'm really glad to see that they did do that. But I get a little worried when I see that it's journalists and academics embarrassing the platforms because they can't be on top of everything. And there's a lot they can't see because the platforms really have so much more visibility than we do. And then there's this other problem that now there are these private groups all over Facebook where even the platforms can't really see into them very well. And that's where you get the feeling that a lot of this malicious stuff, and there's a lot of radicalism. We have to start using some of this language of recruitment and radicalization when we see these militias like we saw today going out. There's really a cell. This is really a terrorist cell, I think. Josh, I don't want to step into your lane, but that's what it looks like to me. So anyway, but I'm glad they took down those coordinated pages, but it's all too common a thing that you're really manipulated when you're online. You feel like you're just seeing stuff in the order that your friends post it, and that it's just being shared by people who've seen something interesting. And that if you see a lot of stuff that's self-reinforcing, it's because that must be true. A lot of people are seeing it, and you don't realize that you're being manipulated by either folks who have a political agenda or a financial agenda, or sometimes the same thing. And they're manipulating the information that you see and making it look like it's objective journalism or disinterested journalism. And that's the big problem. And there needs to be not just transparency, but sort of user design to educate you and empower you about what's going on. And as far as what people can do about it, because you asked about that, Rachel, I feel like there is obviously, we can all be skeptical, but this group of people here are critical thinkers. There's one thing I know about everybody on this call: you're critical thinkers. But I think it's too much to ask individuals. This is really a societal problem, and just like if you could say to people who were driving in cars before there were seatbelts, what can you do? I mean, the car companies needed to put in seatbelts. They didn't want to put in seatbelts. It wasn't going to cost them very much to put in seatbelts, but they didn't want to. Laws were passed. They had to put in seatbelts. They dealt with it. We have to change the incentives a little bit so that there's more safety.
I don't see any hands, so I'm just reading questions from the chat. Dorothy Rick asked, can someone discuss algorithms and their effect on misinformation?
Want to go? Oh, me? Okay.
You start, Karen. This is right up your alley.
I'll start. I know, but I get really boring when I start talking about this stuff. So yeah, it was just what I was talking about before, that you're in a group and you're recommended another group. You're reading your Twitter feed and something pops up. You think that that's somehow just either random or it's because it's chronological. There are these algorithms, and one of the things they're optimizing for is just to keep you online, because the incentives, the main business of the platforms, I'm not being judgmental about it, their business is to serve you ads, just like on broadcast or cable television. they make their money by selling you ads. And so they want to keep you online. And so often the algorithm will feed you what's not in there. There'll be a conflict between what's in society and your own interest and what's in the platform's interest. It's not always in conflict, but sometimes it's in conflict. And it's in conflict when the platform wants to show you stuff that's conspiratorial, that appeals to your identity, that's salacious, so that you'll, oh, wow, I didn't know that. And you'll like it and you'll share it and you'll stay online to learn more, and you'll see more and more ads. So that's the problem with the algorithms. And the recommendations is, again, as I was saying, you can be in a group about ADHD because you suspect your kid may have ADHD, and then they'll give you, oh gee, people who are interested in ADHD are also interested in the problems with vaccines. And the next thing you know, you think the earth is flat and vaccines are terrible and 5G is going to bring about the end of the world. And you don't even realize that's happened because the algorithm just thinks that's what you would naturally be interested in. And so there's a lot of discussion both in Europe and the US. How do we make these algorithms more transparent? Is there some way we could make them optimize for some other things? It's a really complicated issue, but really important.
And they also seem to be addicting. When you get into these things, there's an endorphin issue, even when you start getting online and getting all this feedback, and it's terrifying.
It's a real problem. And this, just to add to what you're saying and what Karen was saying, is it really relates back to the last question and Karen's good answer to it about today's news about this pro-Trump youth group troll farm type thing, because where the tech companies are trying to enter this process comes after the algorithms, right? So I think today's takedown falls under Facebook's category that they call coordinated inauthentic behavior, and Karen's nodding. So that's when they see people organizing and using and abusing essentially an awareness of how to make things go viral and get people addicted and get people to stay on the site. And good on them for trying to deal with that, but the algorithm's going to come first, right? So that the algorithmically driven problems will continue, even if those who know how to exploit them or spend money to exploit them in ways that get stopped occasionally are halted by the companies. And thus far, there's been, as Karen says, a real reluctance to adjust algorithms, at least in any transparent way, and at least in any way that those of us who care about these issues can understand, evaluate, maybe even criticize, or maybe just productively push in a better direction. And yet that comes before.
If they fix the algorithms, then they'll lose a lot of money.
That's why I think they do worry about that.
Okay, Dawn had a question.
Yeah, hi. So I'm curious about the opinions from the speakers about the ability, the appropriateness of the social media companies to really do their own curation of things like hate speech or misinformation. It seems to me that from what I've read, that they are doing a kind of a half-hearted attempt to curate, and they're really not even internally, from what I understand, terribly transparent about what the ground rules are. Is it appropriate for these companies to be doing their own, make up the rules as they go kind of thing, or should there be some kind of an external thing that is responsible in some sense for setting ground rules?
Karen, you want to start on this?
Yeah, well, I keep wanting to write something with Josh about this. Yeah, but so in the early days of the internet, there was this concept, it was called self-regulation, but the idea wasn't really self-regulation per se, like each platform could just do what it wants and not tell anybody. The idea was that there were regulators hanging out there who said, we don't want to write a reg, but we'll tell you where we want you to go, and you guys get together and agree on it, and we'll hold you accountable. That has devolved into, we'll kind of do what we want, we'll let you know about it later. we need to get back to a more transparent, enforceable set of systems. And so what we could do is, and this is being done on the violent extremist side. We need to, the platforms really need to come together. They need to think, I think, and Europe is ahead of us in talking about it this way, on a risk-based approach, and Twitter has started talking about it this way too. So instead of saying there's imminent harm, we're going to take it down because, there was this situation where in the fires in the Northwest, there were these rumors started that Antifa was spreading the fires. So people weren't leaving their homes because they thought Antifa were going to take their homes, and they were all flooding the 911 numbers. So the sheriffs had to put out a statement saying, please stop calling us. It is not Antifa. Local militias set up checkpoints on the highways to check people's IDs to make sure they weren't Antifa. Finally, the FBI had to put out a statement. RT got involved. Finally, Facebook said, we're taking down this rumor because it's causing imminent harm. And Twitter's evolved view is, we're not going to wait until it's that out of control that there's imminent harm tomorrow. We're going to say, what's the risk that this would pose a big harm if it spread widely? And then we're not going to take it down at that point, but we're not going to amplify it, and we're going to put notices on it, and we're not going to show you how many likes it got, because we don't want to add fuel to the flames. And I think they need to get together and come up with some kind of risk-based approach and tell the regulators, these are the procedures we're going to put in place, and there needs to be some kind of monitoring that they're following through on this. And there are various ways that the government has that they could use to bring them together to do something like that. It's very complicated. There'll be a lot of back and forth, and but I think people realize we've got to get to a point like that. Unfortunately, Trump is going in the opposite direction. He says the worst thing you can do is moderate, because you're moderating conservatives, and that shows that you're biased and you're hurting people's free speech. And so he, going beyond anything Richard Nixon tried to do in Watergate, where he went after the Washington Post broadcast license and CBS because they were covering Watergate, Trump has taken a page from that book but gone beyond it, and is trying to get his regulators and DOJ to go after the platforms for moderating at all. So he's trying to really lean in the other direction. I hope we'll go towards the more code of conduct kind of approach. I lost everybody. That was so complicated. Josh, save me.
No, that was great. And I'll just say one more thing, and I know we want to get to maybe one more question, but just to sort of dive into one point that Karen made, I think these companies have seen particular challenges in content as an issue by issue thing. The early days of the internet, child exploitation imagery was a problem. And very gradually, I think too gradually in many of our eyes, something was created, a structure was created. It's better. It's not solved, but it's better. And then radicalization and terrorism became a big problem. And eventually, after many of us who were working on counterterrorism in the government thought too much had been allowed to stay up, the companies got better. I don't think it's a problem solved, but they got better. Election interference cropped up in 2016, not only in the US. Brexit, turns out, there was a lot of Russian disseminated disinformation. They seem to take this issue by issue, and that seems too late, given the stakes of these issues. Terrorism, our fundamental democratic choice. And so instead, doing something that's risk-based and driven by a sense that new topics will arise in which these platforms will be a vector for really challenging content to surge very quickly, that seems to offer a possibility of being less behind the curve every time.
Thank you. We can take one last question from the floor, if there's someone who wants to raise a question. And if not, then I'm going to read one of the questions that had been submitted. Anyone? No? Then there's a question from Catherine. A lot of political surveys are worded in a way that provoke animosity against groups like immigrants. What's the best way to recognize manipulation in surveys?
I am definitely no expert on pollsters and surveys, so I may use the question and to speak to a little bit of a a broader point, which is this idea of provoking animosity in this cycle, right? Where, we saw this in 2016, in my view, from the Trump campaign, which was built on animosity against certain groups. If you think about building a border wall, that's built on animosity against those you're trying to keep out. If you think about promising a Muslim ban, that's built on animosity against one of the world's great religions. And it was awful, but in some ways felt isolated to that campaign, especially with many in the party at that point keeping some distance from the campaign. Of course, that campaign became the President of the United States, and the party came along with him. And so the extent to which animosity has been mainstreamed in political dialogue is absolutely part of what's happening in this 2020 cycle that we're here talking about tonight. And even to see just little things in language. The fact that I gather President Trump today, whatever show he called into, he referred to Senator Harris multiple times as a monster. I mean, that would have been headline news 5 years ago, that certainly the sitting president, but frankly, anyone close to that stature would refer to a sitting senator with language like that would have been headline news. And now, regrettably, it's become, in a sense, normalized as part of political discourse. And so voters will, of course, make their choice this year about candidates. But I think bigger than that is the question of where political discourse goes in this country, which informs where societal discourse and other things go in this country, and whether that animosity is going to remain the feature that it regrettably seems to have become, or whether there's a way to pull back from that is a huge question.
That seems to me like a great way to end the conversation, unless, Karen, there was anything that you wanted to add. But to me, that really does get to the crux of what has happened in our society and in these institutions, in the last 4 years, and what the future will hold, and how we can kind of forge better rules and norms, but also commitments between each other to make this turn out differently the next time. So back to you, Aniko, but I just wanted to say thanks very much from my part, and for my co-panelists, and to all of you for not only coming in the first place, but returning after the Zoom bomb. So thanks again.
Thanks, Rachel, for your great questions, and Aniko and Sheila.
Adding my thanks. This has been a great discussion. Glad to be part of it.
Thank you so much for joining us. This was great. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you to Joshua for suggesting the event, and for Rachel and Karen to agree, and for the wonderful questions and the discussion. And as Rachel, I could just echo Rachel's sentiments that I appreciate you guys coming back and bearing with us through this very interesting experience. And we really appreciate your time and efforts that you dedicate to the association, and thank you so much. And check out, we have a couple of other very interesting events coming up, so just check out our websites for upcoming events and join us whenever you can. Thank you so much, and appreciate you guys coming. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye now. Good night.